It's all about the bumps in your heart.
This video is probably going to be one of the longer videos of the course, but it's also going to be one of the most informative. What we're going to do in this video is we are going to create our very first Hello World React component. Now there's two different ways to do this. There's an easy way and there is a hard way. The easy way is using a tool called Create React App. So what Create React App does under the hood is it allows you to create a React application by running one command. So what that looks like is once you install it, you can run npx create react app and then the name of the application you're creating. Now Create React App is great, but I think it's important as a developer to understand what the tools that you use are doing under the hood. So what we're going to do is instead of taking the easy way and using Create React App to create our application, we're actually just going to create it ourselves by using Webpack and Babel. So in order to do that, go ahead and open up your terminal. And this is where you can start coding along with me. So the very first thing we're going to do is make a brand new folder. And we're going to call it GitHub Battle, or the name of our application that we're going to be building. So let's go ahead and move into that folder. And now we want to initialize a brand new NPM project. So I assume you have NPM installed. So what you can do is go ahead and run npm init-y. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a brand new package.json file for you that looks something like this. So now that we have our package.json file, we can actually go ahead and start downloading or installing packages from the npm directory. So what we'll do is we're going to install two. The first one is going to be React, and the second one is going to be React-DOM. So now if we look at the content of our folder now, you'll notice we still have our package.json. We have this package lock that we're just going to ignore. And then we have this node modules directory. So if we go into the node modules directory, you'll see that we have a few different libraries here. We have React and React DOM, but we also have all of these other libraries that we didn't install. So what these are is they are libraries that React and React DOM depend on. So when we install a library from npm, what we'll get is the library itself, as well as any other libraries that the libraries we installed depend on as well. So now the very next thing we're going to do is we are going to create a gitignore file. The reason for this is because we are going to be pushing our code up to GitHub as we progress throughout the course. But what we don't want to push up to GitHub is our node modules folder. The reason for that is because if you look at our package.json file, we're keeping track of all of the different packages that we are installing. So if someone wants to come and contribute to our project, what they'll do is they'll clone our code from GitHub. They'll run npm install, which will go ahead and install all of the dependencies that the project needs, and then they'll be good to go. So again, we don't want to push up our entire node modules folder because it could be really large. So instead what we'll do, I'm going to go ahead and open up this in Sublime, is we will create a brand new file here called gitignore. Inside of here, we will put our node modules folder. So that way, when we commit our code and we push it up to GitHub, we make sure we don't push our whole node modules folder. And because we're here, I'm going to go ahead and add a few other things. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to add DS store. And then eventually what's going to happen, and we're actually going to do this in this video, is we're going to use Webpack to bundle all of our code together. And that's going to output our code into a folder called dist. So we also don't want to push all of our dist code up to GitHub because we can go ahead and just generate that whenever we need to, as we'll see later on. So go ahead and save this. And finally, let's go ahead and actually start building our project. So what we will do is let's go ahead and make a new folder here. We're going to call it app. And inside of our app folder, we're going to have eventually a lot of different files. For now, let's go ahead and just create a few of them. We'll have our index.css file. We're going to also have our index.js file. And one more. For now, we will have our index.html file. So let's start with what, in my opinion, is the funnest part and the reason you are here, which is going to be our JavaScript file so we can create our first React component. Now, this won't necessarily work initially because we still have to implement Webpack and Babel, but for now, it's good to just write it out. So the very first thing we're going to do is we are going to import the React library. And we can do that because earlier we ran npm install. So we're going to grab React. We're also going to grab React DOM, and we'll get to that here in a second. And then now we're going to create our very first React component. So the way that you do that is you create an ES6 class. So the name of our component we'll call app. And then what we do is we're going to say this is going to extends react.component. So technically that is the body for our very first component. And then now when you think about a React component, I always want you to think about how it can have 3 different aspects to it. So a component can have a few different things. The first one is it can have some state that it manages. That's the whole idea of React is you have these components. They're each able to manage their own state. And then you build out your entire application by composing those components together. The next piece that a component have is called lifecycle, whether that's fetching some data from an API or doing some event when the component is added to the DOM itself. That's the next aspect of a component. And then finally, in the aspect of a component we're going to focus on in this video is the actual UI. So the method that we use in order to describe what the UI of the component is going to look like is called render. So now what we need to return from render, again, is the description of what the UI is going to look like. Now, do you know of any tool or language that will allow us to describe kind of visually what UI looks like? Well, what about just like normal HTML? So what if we come in here and do something like this? Now your brain might have just literally exploded because this looks like it is a violation of the separation of concerns principle, which is where you should keep your CSS separate from your JavaScript, separate from your HTML. But really, what is the concern? If that's the argument, what is the concern of the component? Well, we defined it earlier. A component is concerned about state, lifecycle, and UI. So I'd argue that this isn't a violation of separation of concerns because a component is concerned about the UI layer. So this is actually valid React, and this right here is called JSX. What we can actually do is if we wrap this in parens, we can bring this down to a new line here just to make it look a little bit better. And then this is actually one of the reasons that we need Babel, because what Babel is going to do is before we ever ship this to the browser, obviously the browser wouldn't understand this HTML-ish looking syntax inside of this JavaScript looking syntax. So what Babel's whole job is it's going to convert or compile this code right here, which is called JSX, into code that looks like this, which is really just regular old JavaScript using this create element invocation. And there's a whole text section after this video you can read through to learn more about create element and the difference between an element and a component. But know that whenever you write JSX that looks like this, really what's happening is before it's ever shipped to a browser, Babel's going to go ahead and take care of that and convert it to just normal JavaScript invocations. So now that we have our very first React component, it's looking great. The next thing we need to do is actually render it to the DOM. So if you'll remember earlier, we imported React DOM. And so what we can do is we're going to come in here and say React DOM. React DOM has a render method. And this render method is going to take 2 different arguments. The first one is going to be a React element. And the second one is going to be where to render the element to. So let's think about what the first one is going to be. We have our component right here that we very elegantly defined. Now, how do we get a React element out of that? Well, if you remember earlier, we said that when Babel gets a hold of our JSX, it's going to convert it into these create element invocations. So what that means is whenever you use JSX, really what's being created under the hood for you is an element. So if we want to pass an element to the first argument of React DOM.render, what we can do is we can use JSX and say app, because we know that this is going to be converted to a React element. So the way I think about this is how you define a component with the name of the component, and then you extend React.component, and the way that you use a component is like this, which really just creates a brand new React element under the hood. And then now the next question we need to answer is, where do we want to render this element to? Well, eventually what we'll have inside of our index.html file here is an element that has an ID of app. So what we'll say is we want to render our element to, and let's go ahead and grab document.getElement by ID. So we'll grab the element that has an ID of app. So everything looks great so far. We have our component. We're using React DOM.render to render that component to the DOM. The next thing we haven't really talked about yet is why the React DOM package is separate from React. If you look at what React DOM does, again, it allows us to render a React element to the DOM, but that seems like a pretty foundational part of React. Why isn't that just part of React itself rather than its own package? Well, turns out React is actually a pretty elegant solution for building UI regardless of the environment that it's in. So in our example, or in our use case, we're building React for the DOM, so we're rendering React to the DOM, but other people might want to render it in other environments, like an iOS app, an Android app, or even like an Xbox. So the reason React DOM is decoupled from React itself is because just because you're using React doesn't necessarily mean you're rendering it to a DOM environment or a browser environment. So now there's only one more part of this file that we need to add, and that is actually importing our CSS. So that may sound a little bit weird that we are importing a CSS file, but we want all of the styles on our index or in our index.css file to be active for our component. So right now this file is done, but there's a few different things that we need to do in order to make it work. I've already kind of mentioned them. The first is we are using modules up here. So we need some sort of module bundler to go ahead and take all of our modules. Right now we just have one, but eventually we're going to have a lot more, and bundle all of those together so that the browser can understand that. And then we also need a way to transform our JSX into just normal JavaScript so the browser can also understand that. So the two tools we are going to use in order to do this is going to be webpack and is going to be Babel. We'll use webpack in order to bundle all of our different modules together, and we're going to use Babel in order to transform our JSX into normal JavaScript and also transform some of the future, you could say, JavaScript syntax into normal JavaScript syntax that the browser can understand today. So now in order to get webpack and Babel working, we need to install a bunch of different packages. So head over to your terminal again, and above this video, there should be a little code snippet that you can copy. That is going to be this one right here. So we're going to talk about all of these individually as we use them, but we have Babel Core, Babel Preset Env, Babel Preset React, Babel Loader, CSS Loader, HTML Webpack Plugin, Style Loader, Webpack, and Webpack CLI, and Webpack Dev Server. So once all of those packages are finally installed, head back over to your code. And in the main directory, again, not in your app directory, but in the main GitHub Babel directory, we're going to create a new file here. We're going to call it webpack.config.js. Now, before we actually dive into this file, I just want to say it is a little overwhelming if this is your first time writing a Webpack config. So we'll take it slow. So first, what we're going to do, again, is just look at high level what Webpack is doing. Typically, when you write an application, you're going to end up with all of these different modules. So over here, we have some JavaScript modules, some images, a Sass module, whatever. What Webpack does is it takes those and bundles them all together, so it looks a little bit more like this over here. Now, why is that important? Well, what happens is, again, Webpack is going to create us a single bundle, and then all we have to do is reference that bundle inside of our HTML page. So instead of having a bunch of different scripts as you may be used to, because Webpack is going to create us just a single bundle.js, we just have to reference that inside of our HTML page rather than all of our different scripts and all of our different libraries. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our webpack.config file. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to be dealing with the file system a little bit. So let's go ahead and require path. You don't need to npm install this because it's going to come with Node. And then next we are going to use CommonJS to export an object, which is going to describe or really not even describe, it's going to be all of our configuration settings for Webpack. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define where the entry point of our application is. So if you think about this, it's going to be kind of the main file in our application, which is going to kick off everything else. Because what's going to happen is we will go ahead and render our app component. And then eventually what's going to happen is app is going to render something else, which is going to render something else. It's going to create kind of like a tree. So app/index.js is going to be kind of the main root file of our application. It's going to be where our main module is. And so what we can do is the entry point is going to be ./app/index.js. Next, we need to define where the bundle that Webpack creates is going to go. So again, remember, Webpack takes some assets, bundles them, and outputs them. This step is telling Webpack where to actually put that file. So the name of it is output. Path is going to be, and this is where we're going to use path.resolve. We'll say whatever the directory name is, and then we will just say dist. And then the file name for this is going to be just index_bundle.js. So again, what's going to happen is Webpack is going to bundle all of our modules together, starting at our app/index.js module. It's then going to create a brand new folder called dist inside of the root of our GitHub Battle folder. Inside of that folder, it's going to then put the file that it creates, which it's going to call index_bundle.js. So now we've defined our entry point of our application, and we've defined where the output file that Webpack creates us is going to go. The next thing we need to do is actually define the type of transformations that need to be made on our code. So the way that we'll do that is create another property here on this object, which is going to be called module. Inside of here, we're going to have a property called rules, and this is going to be an array. So the way that you divide which transformations are being made on which file type is with these rules. So what we'll do is we'll say test. We're going to have a regular expression here. So we want to select all the JavaScript files. And I'm no regex master, but apparently this will do it. And then what we want to do is we want to use the Babel loader on them. So again, what's happening here is we're saying as Webpack is bundling all of our modules together, anytime it sees a JavaScript file, it's going to go ahead and run the Babel loader transformation on it. So then later on, what we'll need to do is we will need to specify the different types of transformations we want Babel to actually make. And just to show this again, now instead of selecting all of the JavaScript files, we want to select all of the CSS files. And now the loaders or the transformations we want to make on the CSS files is going to be our style loader, as well as what's called the CSS loader. And all of these, Babel loader, style loader, and CSS loader, were installed previously when we ran that big installation command. It's right here, as well as right here. So again, what this says to do is any JavaScript module inside of our application, go ahead and run the Babel loader on it. What that does is basically just to say, Babel, go ahead and transform our code in any way that you want. So we're going to set that up in the next step. And then now on any CSS file inside of our application, go ahead and run the style loader as well as the CSS loader on it. What the CSS loader does is it's going to look for any CSS imports or any time where we use something like this, where we have like a background image, and it's going to transform this into just require syntax. And then what style loader is going to do is it's going to take the CSS that's being required and insert it into the page directly so that the styles are actually active on that page. And where we can see this is inside of our index.js file. So the reason that this syntax works right here is because we've included the style loader. So at this point, we have our entry, we have our output, we have our rules. And then now what we need to do is define a mode. So what a mode is it's either one of two things. So it's pretty simple. It's either in development mode or it's in production mode. When it's in production mode, which we'll do at the end of this course when we actually prep and deploy our app to production, it'll do things like minify it and basically just get it ready to be deployed to production. But for now, because we're not going to do that yet, we'll go ahead and put it in development mode. So at this point, we're almost done with our webpack config, but now we're going to jump over and worry about and implement really our Babel loader. So again, remember Babel is what's going to take our JSX and convert it into just normal React.create element invocations that the browser can understand. And it's also going to take any of the modern JavaScript that we use inside of our project and convert it so that specific browsers can understand it, even if those browsers haven't actually implemented it yet. So the way that we'll do that is head over to your package.json file. And really anywhere here, I'm going to do it by these scripts. We're going to add a Babel property. And if you'll remember earlier, we downloaded a few different packages related to Babel. Specifically, the ones we care about right now are these presets. We have preset env and preset react. Now, these presets are what's going to define the types of transformations we want to make with Babel. So what we'll do is inside of here, go ahead and create a presets array.